Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. We're so glad to see such a strong turnout for this wonderful event that we've organized for you. My name is Pastor Zane Ridings and I'll be serving as the host for our event today. And then our retired minister Dan Bryant will be serving as the moderator, and he'll tell you about who all these lovely people are. But just on behalf of the church, I want to thank you all for being here and all of you for this important conversation about Christian nationalism. So I first get the privilege of giving you a few housekeeping things. If anybody needs a restroom or a glass of water or anything like that, those are all available down this hallway here through that door at the edge of the sanctuary. If you have any other questions about anything you might need, there are ushers in the back to help you. You were given cards to ask questions of the panel. I think they're going to tell you more about that later. And then, like I said, if you need anything at all, please ask myself or the ushers in the back. I'm going to now open us in prayer. God of us all, we ask that you look down on these proceedings and see your children of many faiths or of no faith grappling with these issues of nationalism and religion. We ask that you bless this time to be a time of learning and thinking about what we may be able to do to combat the corruptions of nationalism as they find ourselves in our religions. May it please be so. Amen.
Thank you, Zane. It is a delight to be here as a moderator in a different role than what I was used to doing in my previous life as the pastor of this wonderful congregation, and just thrilled that they let me do things like this and now 4 years after my retirement from the church. I am Dan Bryant. By the way, this event is being streamed live. It will be recorded and available on the church's through the church's YouTube channel, which is heartofelugene.org. So if you like what you hear, or if you don't, but you can make people aware of its recording and availability there. So before I introduce the panel, let me just set up this dialogue a little bit, because we hear quite a bit about Christian nationalism these days in the news, and I was struck that just yesterday in the Register-Guard, I know a lot of people don't take the paper anymore, but in the Register-Guard there was this article that was entitled, "Trump Allies Advocate for Retribution," and I'll just quote part of it. "Trump speaks only in generalities about his intentions, but for the most part, a former top Trump national security official likely to join him in a new administration has been crisscrossing America, recruiting an army of volunteers to help carry out such a plan. And that person is Michael Flynn, a retired Army Lieutenant General and Trump's first White House National Security Advisor. You may remember him, I suspect. At Flynn's side is his longtime aide, Ivan Raiklin, a former Green Beret, retired Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel, and former DIA employee who's also a conservative lawyer. Flynn and Raiklin are among the most vocal of a cadre of Trump allies calling for prosecution and even violence against the former president's political enemies. Raiklin, who calls himself Trump's Secretary of Retribution, he even has T-shirts with that on it, has gone so far as to complete a deep state target list of more than 350 people he says he'll go after in a second Trump administration. Together, Flynn and Raiklin have been barnstorming for a far-right, anti-government form of Christian nationalism, railing against what they see as a woke takeover of America by communist sympathizers aligned with China, such as the fine folk you see here. At the far right, Rod of Iron Freedom Festival. Take note of that. Rod of Iron Freedom Festival on October 11th in Greeley, Pennsylvania. One attendee asked Flynn whether, if Trump wins, he would get his rank reinstated and sit at the head of a military tribunal to not only drain the swamp, but imprison the swamp and on a few occasions execute the swamp. Flynn replied, I think a lot of people actually think like you do, and I think that's your right and our privilege. These people are already up to no good, he said of Trump's opponents. So we got to win first, we win, and then Katie barred the door. Believe me, the gates of hell, my hell, will be unleashed. This is what we are addressing here today, this evening. So what exactly is Christian nationalism? It's not simply the belief that we are a Christian nation. Rather, Christian nationalism is a political ideology that seeks to promote a specific interpretation of Christianity as a central part of national identity and governance. Proponents believe that the nation should be defined by Christian values, advocating for laws and policies that reflect these beliefs, such as the idea that life begins at conception. And we have seen the result of that belief here in the last few years. Christian nationalism typically believe that they are acting at the direction of God and that God wills those who hold like beliefs to take charge of the country, even by violence if necessary. So the Register Guard article referenced the Rod of Iron Freedom Festival. This was a series of revivals. It's one such. There was another one called the Courage Tour. A series of revivals held mostly in swing states where one could hear right-wing preachers and practice firing weapons. It goes together. Study your Bible and learn how to fire your gun. I don't know, we missed that somehow in this church. I'm not sure why. But at any rate, Rod of Iron is a reference to Revelation 19, which states that the coming Lord will smite the nations and rule them with a rod of iron. We could talk another time about the proper and misinterpretation of the book of Revelation. Maybe that'll come up tonight, but that's another big subject. But their website states, Christ is our king, but Donald Trump is his anointed to break America out of a deep state tyranny and threatens the future of our nation and the entire world. So you may have guessed by now that the views of Christian nationalism are not represented by anyone up front here on the chancel. I'm sorry to report. Well, actually, I'm not sorry to report that. But rather, we are here to share our concern about the danger that it presents to our country and the principles on which it was founded. So let me begin with those principles. The proponents of Christian nationalism point to the 56 men, all white men, of course, who signed the Declaration of Independence, most of whom who were Christian leaders of some sort, including some who published Bibles, taught in their churches, and one who was a Presbyterian minister, John Witherspoon. The Declaration, of course, begins by asserting that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And it also concludes with an appeal to the supreme judge of the world. Now, those proponents will also cite various founders of our nation who asserted the importance of biblical faith and values to the governance of our nation. John Adams, for instance, wrote that the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. So what's wrong with that? Well, at the panel here, we have on my far right, he's not usually on my far right, but he is tonight on your left, former Representative Phil Barnhart, who served in the state legislature for 18 years, if I'm remembering. Is that right, Phil? Is also a lawyer. Next to him is Jenny Jonak, who is a local attorney who was elected to the school board, 4J, a couple years ago, and is now the chair of the school board. In the center, a gentleman you may recognize, Representative Peter DeFazio, who is Oregon's longest-serving member of Congress for 36 years. I'm very privileged to have Representative DeFazio here this evening. Next to him is Rabbi Ruhi, Sophia, Motzkin, Rubenstein. Did I get it all? Did I get them all in there? Yeah, pretty close. And good friend. And Rabbi Ruhi is very well known in the interfaith community. I think most of Eugene claims her as their rabbi. And of course, is the rabbi at Temple Beth Israel here since 2015. And next to her, Andrew Langford, who is a pastor of Emmaus Lutheran Church and also teaches in biblical studies in the religious department at the University of Oregon. So Andrew, I'm going to begin with you, since you're closest, to address that question of what is wrong with this idea that we are a Christian nation and should not be ashamed of proclaiming that.
Okay. Well, let's see if we can get this. I have a sinking mic here, so we'll see if it kind of stays up. First, I want to say thank you for the invitation. Also, thanks to Pastor Zane for opening this space for us, and to the panelists here. I'm really excited for this conversation. And thank you for taking time on a Sunday afternoon. This is a topic that touches us all or will touch us all in some way. I'm sad to predict. And so it's important that we have this conversation, which I don't need to convince you if you're here. But I guess as a way of helping situate myself, I am a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America denomination, which is a mainline Protestant denomination. It is an umbrella for congregations that have a variety of people and political affiliations, but on the whole, it skews progressive. I come from a tradition that is the Churches of Christ, which is a sibling or a cousin of Disciples of Christ. And so I grew up in Texas, and I have a lot of experience with people who view the Bible in a lot of different ways and have different approaches to Christianity. So in my role as a scholar, as a biblical scholar, I teach at the University of Oregon in the Department of Religious Studies. And so I kind of have vested interest both in how this political affects, how the political ideology affects the Christian church and how it affects our community members, and also how it affects the Bible in public discourse. And I just want to make a note that I am not interested today in defending the Bible from Christian nationalists, okay? I don't think it needs defense. I don't think God needs defense. I don't think Christianity as a whole needs defense. What I'm interested in is talking about how these ideas impact people. Because as a Christian, I believe that is my primary charge, is to love God and love people and to defend and protect whenever we can against pernicious ideas or misinterpretations or ideologies. So to kind of take a running start at this question of, what's the problem with declaring ourselves a Christian nation? Well, I want to just point out the obvious, that the First Amendment, right, recognizes the separation of church and state and declares that there should be no establishment of religion. So just as a pluralist, democratic society, I'm concerned about any movement that has anti-democratic tendencies and that would privilege one particular group over another, even though, as a Christian, that happens to be my group. Although in reality, not all Christianity is, there's more than one Christianity, I guess is the best way to say it. And so whenever we talk about Christian nationalism, I think it's important that we be very clear that this is one interpretation and one iteration of claiming the moniker, the label of Christian, and that is a label and a title that all those who identify as Christians should put up a fight for, so to speak, right? It is our term, it is my term to try and define and to lay claim to. So I think it's important to say that. The other thing I'd note is that I don't think that Christian nationalism as an ideology is actually that thoroughly Christian. I think it lays claim to the symbols of Christianity, sometimes to the language of Christianity, sometimes to the text of Christianity, but in and of itself has kind of cynically co-opted the language of Christianity for its own political purposes. So I think that's important to note. So I guess I come at it as an engaged citizen. I care about America. I love America, and I want to see it flourish. And I think we do that best when we resist xenophobia and violence and racism, which Christian nationalism is often associated with. And then as a Christian pastor, I care about the people that are affected by this, not only the Christians and the people in my congregation, but all people in my community, right? Are people of all faiths or no faith who are ultimately harmed by this.
Thank you, Andrew. So you raised the issue of church and state, so I think that is probably something we need to talk a little bit more about, particularly given our Supreme Court and some of the decisions it has made recently that has, if not nullified that separation, certainly has weakened it. So Peter, I know you have done a little research on this. Do you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah, I think both Phil and I are going to address this issue, so I'll start. You know, you just need to think back to the colonies in the United States, before the United States. And they were fleeing religious conflict and persecution. You know, Puritans, obviously, and then others who came here from other countries for other reasons, for the conflicts in Europe. You know, even though they were fleeing religious, persecution, they, to some extent, engaged in it when they came to the new country, and began to impose, essentially state-sanctioned religion here of their choosing, as opposed to what they had fled in England or other parts of Europe. I mean, one extreme example would be Maryland. They actually banned, Catholics from holding any office and ultimately from voting or owning property. The various colonies had different political aspirations or religious aspirations. And that had an extreme impact on the founders, those who wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, particularly Jefferson. And, he was very adamant about this issue and was really the driving force at the Constitutional Convention on separation of church and state. First, we had, of course, the Constitution, which didn't say much about religion. There was only one section in Article 6 that no religious test shall be required as a qualification for any office or public trust in the United States. So, okay, that gives you a little bit of, separation and that, but it's still not exactly definitive. So then, of course, as was previously mentioned, we come to the First Amendment, which really protects religious freedom in two interconnected and necessary ways. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof. The problem, as was just mentioned by Dan, is that we have a Supreme Court now that seems to only be really looking at half of the First Amendment. And that is they're leaning far, far over on what would constitute an infringement upon the free exercise of religion, moving the needle rather dramatically from where we had been. Back in 1947, Hugo Black said the wall between state and church must be kept high and impregnable. He was actually quoting Jefferson, and Jefferson, as president, had written a letter to the Baptists in Virginia who were fearing persecution and assuring them with those same words that the wall of separation would be high and impregnable. So but with the new leanings of this court seeming to not really encompass the whole of the First Amendment, is becoming more and more problematic. We have repeal of Roe v. Wade, but from the Christian nationalists really want to repeal the 1962 decision, Engel versus Vitale, whereas the government was not allowed to tell children how or when to pray, i.e. imposing prayer at schools. And this is one of their major objectives, as much as they wanted to repeal Roe, this is right next to that. And unfortunately, as I said, this court is leaning toward the free exercise more. Since Roberts became Chief Justice, religious organizations have won 83% of the cases brought before the Supreme Court. And, we have, and of course, it isn't just the court. We have Speaker Johnson in the House who had displayed an appeal to heaven flag outside his office, which was carried by many when they attempted the coup on January 6th. And it has been adopted by the Christian nationalist groups as their symbol. There were two sets of Christian nationalists there. There were many who participated in the violence and the invasion. There was another group that's reported to have stayed outside and praying, and they saw a great serpent over the Senate, and they were engaged in speaking in tongues and offering prayer to drive away the serpent. And of course, what they really wanted was to destroy the ballot boxes and send. Congress would have had to go back to the states, ask for them to replace them, and many of the states at that point would not have replaced their electors, and Trump would have been president. That was the whole intent of this. When it goes to the House, Trump wins. The Republicans hold the majority of the states. Every state gets one vote. Alaska gets one. California gets one. This is, I think, a dangerous time politically for this nation. It was mentioned earlier about this, there's the new apostolic reformation. They have the Seven Mountain Mandate, which is spiritual warfare, Christian control of all aspects of society, business, government, arts, entertainment, education, family, and religion, and ending the separation of church and state. He mentioned Michael Flynn, or someone mentioned Michael Flynn with the Reawaken America movement, and he says, if we are going to have one nation under God, we must have one religion. And there are even, there are worse characters out there. Lauren Boebert, church is supposed to direct the government not supposed to direct the church. Not how the founding fathers intended it. I'm tired of the separation of church and state crap or junk. She said, not in the Constitution. It was a stinking letter and means nothing, like what they say it does. And then even again, Speaker Johnson, the separation of church and state is a misnomer, because the founders did not want government to encroach on the church, not that they didn't want the benefits of faith to have influence on public life. It's exactly the opposite. So between the court and the coming election, we are approaching, I think, a crossing point in our society that I never thought we'd see.
Thank you, Peter. Phil, did you want to add anything to that, or did you cover it?
Yes, thank you. My name is Phil Barnhart. I've been a Christian, a member of the Episcopal Church since I was 11. I'm now quite a bit older than that. And lately I've been studying these issues yet again. Those of us who've been to law school have spent a good deal of time in our first year learning about the things that Peter alluded to, and I want to talk about a couple of them a little bit. He's exactly right. The various colonies, of course, had a whole variety of different religious attitudes. Many of them reestablished a religious control, in the same kind of control they were trying to avoid in Europe. And at the time of the Revolution and at the time of the establishment of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, many of the states had established religions with established religious rules. The benign aspects of them are things like the blue laws and similar, Sunday closings and that kind of thing. Those are the more benign aspects. There were many that were much worse than that. But the Founding Fathers had a political problem. How do we get this motley group of states with all these different ideas about how things should be done to agree to a national government? So the Constitution, as it was originally drafted, did not have the first 10 amendments, the things we think of as the Bill of Rights. They came a couple of years later as it became obvious that in order to get the states to agree, they were going to have these rules. So the First Amendment that Peter refers to comes out of the first Congress, which was immediately ratified by the states as the law of the land, along with the other 10 of the 12 that were proposed. Now, the other thing that's key to understanding how this idea of the separation of church and state has developed in the United States is to understand that that rule only applied to the federal government. It did not apply to the states. They were still free to have their own rules inside the state for essentially the establishment of their local control system, with probably the exception of the things that Peter referred to in Maryland and similar things of that sort. It wasn't until after the Civil War, when the Civil War amendments were adopted, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, no slavery, the basic rules about voting and so forth, and then the 15th Amendment that basically said the states are not allowed to infringe upon the rights of American citizens, and defining who those are. And if you look at those amendments, you realize they were getting rid of the 3/5 clause, the infamous clause that applied to slavery, the compromise that allowed the slave states to count 3/5 of a slave when they were trying to figure out how many congressmen they should get in the Congress. That went away with the 14th Amendment. Anyway, the point is, those amendments actually made the first attempt to say, if you're a citizen of the United States, there's a set of things that you have a right to, regardless of what anybody else says, including whatever the states say. Of course, the object of that was to bring the southern states in and to require that the former slaves be allowed to vote and control their own destiny. But it wasn't until the Warren Court in the 50s and 60s that more or less completed the idea that the Bill of Rights applied to the states and to local laws when they adjudicated a bunch of things having to do with the idea of the right of privacy and the right and the application of that 15th Amendment. The rights of the citizens will not be infringed by the states, to apply the first 10 amendments to the 15th Amendment as a way of defining what that amendment meant. And so here we are, almost 100 years after that amendment was adopted, the 15th Amendment was adopted, before it actually becomes fully applied to the states, and it took lots of struggles. One of the cases I think about and refer to is Griswold versus Connecticut, 1965, in which 2 people were arrested in Connecticut for educating a married couple about birth control, and also allowing the woman to buy some birth control supplies. And they were arrested because they violated the local law. The Supreme Court threw out the local law on the basis that the right of privacy existed and that Connecticut could not apply a law that applied to the private behavior between a husband and wife in their own privacy. The other case that Peter referred to, the other two cases, Roe v. Wade and the other one, Metelli, also come out of that same thread. So now what we're dealing with in the Roberts Court is a reaction, is a pulling back from the rule that actually wasn't in effect until the Warren Court in the 50s and 60s, and since then. And so what we're dealing with now is a reaction against that freeing up of personal liberty, privacy, and the rights that people have. And I'm not really talking about Christian nationalism as such, although it certainly applies there. These are people who would like us to believe a myth that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. It was not. It was founded as a collection of states, and we had good politicians who actually understood how to get those states to work together at a time when each of them had their own cherished view of what religion meant in their own state, which of course I've tried to explain the evolution of that idea, the idea of the First Amendment since that time. So as we are looking at Christian nationalism, we have to recognize this is an old thread. It comes, of course, from long ago. The first Christian nationalists, and forgive me for using the term this way, actually was thought up around 350 AD by the church that was supporting the Emperor Constantine, and the huge pogroms that took place then to cleanse the universal Christian church from those bishops and other ministers who believed that the emperor should not be the head of the church. Well, Christian nationalism effectively wants to restore that very old, very dangerous idea.
Thank you, Phil. So let's turn to schools. As you're aware, in the state of Louisiana, it's now law that schools must post copies of the Ten Commandments. The superintendent of schools in Oklahoma has decreed that Bibles must be placed in every classroom. So Jenny, as the chair of this local 4J school board, if we had a superintendent of schools who decreed such things, what would you do?
Let's see. Well, I'm going to start out by saying I can't speak on behalf of the board. I can only speak on my own behalf as I'm here as an individual. But I wanted to talk a little bit, I view it really from two different lenses. One, of course, is with my attorney lens, and one is with, working in schools and some strong feelings about how public schools should work. From an attorney standpoint, some of my other panelists have talked about the Constitution and the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the government from establishing a religion or favoring one over another. Now, a school is a government institution for this purpose, so we cannot use public schools to favor one religion over another or be overly entangled with religion. The other part of the First Amendment is the Free Exercise Clause, which allows citizens' rights to practice religion, and we can't discriminate against religious groups either. And that could be whether they are a Christian religion, the lack of a religion, or some other religion. So that's from a legal perspective. From a public school perspective, public education is designed to be as inclusive as possible. This is the education that's open to all of our students, regardless of background, and it's really important to me that we respect that and that we are keeping public education as inclusive, as open. We don't want students coming to school feeling that one is favored over another because of their religious background or anything else. And so I think while we also need to make sure that we're, respecting students' rights in the religious area, we want to make sure that we're not using school resources to favor one over another. And I think that's really important, because if you are making students feel alienated or not respected, you're going to have a disengagement that may affect attendance. It might affect, how much they're connecting with those teachers and learning. And for a lot of students, it's that relationship with their teachers in that public school that really motivates them to learn and to learn the skills and to be successful.
Rabbi Ruhi, I have heard you speak many times about what it's like living in a predominantly Christian country, and from your perspective as a rabbi. And I'm also aware that Christian nationalists, well, not just Christian nationalists, many in the Christian community refer to our Judeo-Christian heritage as if somehow that includes the Jewish perspective. So respond to what you're hearing about these issues from a genuine Jewish perspective, please.
Well, I can respond from my own perspective. I cannot speak for all Jews. Given that we were all starting with our identity statements, I'm here as a non-Christian and as a patriotic American. It's really important to me to identify as a patriotic American, though I understand that particular word has connotations that may make it surprising to hear that come out of my mouth. My grandmother, who moved here in 1938 from Poland, always at the age of 5, always told her children and grandchildren, "America saved my life." It was very important to her to be a patriotic American and to raise patriotic Americans. I want to also say that I feel very nervous here. And I think it's a combination of, people are just walking in without having to go through security. The door to your church is unlocked. Do you know what a privilege that is?
No.
Do you? You have to go through 2 locked double doors to get into our synagogue. And that, one might argue, has to do a little bit with Christian nationalism. That said, I think Dan partially invited me here because he knows I like to always make my audiences a little bit uncomfortable. I feel a little bit uncomfortable being in a space where it feels to me like a little bit of a smug assumption that we all here are the smart good guys, and those people we're talking about who aren't in the room are the idiotic bad guys. I think that smugness is always dangerous. So I want to be honest that there's not as much a binary between pro-Christian nationalist and a pure separation of church and state as we might like to imagine. If you like having Christmas off as a national holiday from work, if you feel that the idea of giving these random Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Jain holidays that you haven't even heard of and you don't know what they're about off from school, and the idea that scheduling around them seems a little bit ludicrous to you, you may in fact have more sympathy, I won't say to Christian nationalism, but to the reality of Christianity as state religion than might be comfortable to admit. And Christianity is the state religion of the United States. I found it very telling, Representative Barnhart, that you referred to the blue laws as benign. There was a Supreme Court case in 1961 brought by a bunch of Orthodox Jews who, per our religious obligations, cannot engage in commerce on the Sabbath, to challenge Pennsylvania's blue laws and allow them to open their retail businesses on Sundays because their retail businesses were going to be closed on the Sabbath. And 6-3, the justices found that the blue laws did not violate the Constitution. The Jews lost that case. So we're not have as much a separation of church and state that we like to have as ideal. That said, I think what journalist Masha Gessen refers to as aspirational hypocrisy is extraordinarily important. It's important that we invoke the aspiration of separation of church and state, that we hold on to that. And I guess one other loving critique I want to offer to my fellow panelists is, from where I sit, true Christianity looks pretty diverse. True Christianity includes the Crusades. True Christianity includes the Spanish Inquisition. I don't think you as Christians get to sit here and say that your vision of love thy neighbor and don't impose your will on them is the real Christianity, and Christianity of spreading Jesus's good news by the sword if necessary is not real. From my generational trauma inheritance, I will tell you that Christianity is plenty real. It has plenty of history behind it. And for sure, I'm happy to join you in advocating against it, that shouldn't be the Christianity that is the law of this land. But again, I want to challenge us to push against the binaries that set up the group of people in the room as the smart, right people who really know what Christianity is. And I will say, it's totally my struggle too. In this moment in history, I am constantly resisting the temptation to speak for real Jewish values, in contrast to Jews that I think are behaving in ways that are terrible. But they are still Jews. There was a great Forward article published about a year ago. Forward is a national Jewish publication, saying Jews who disagree with you are still Jews. Christians who disagree with you are still Christians, and they're invoking things that exist and have strong history in Christianity. So to the extent that this is going to be, and it is going to be, an important dispute what the vision is of Christianity in the U.S., I really want to invite us into uncomfortable honesty about that, uncomfortable wrestling with the fullness of what Christianity has been and is. And say, with all of that, with all of the hypocrisy of the aspiration of separation of church and state in the U.S., it's been pretty comfortable for minority religions, at least for Jews. Judaism and Jews, at least some Jews, have had the dubious privilege of being a privileged religious minority in the U.S., especially since World War II. And it was in World War II and the Four Chaplains incident. Have you heard of should I describe it briefly? I'll describe it briefly. There was a ship in the South Pacific that was torpedoed and went down, and there were not enough lifeboats, life jackets. So the four chaplains on that ship, who were two different denominations of Christian, Catholic, and Jewish, gave away their life jackets and were last seen arm in arm singing hymns as they went down with the ship. And that incident is widely credited with this sort of a nation of many faiths, Judeo-Christian mythology in the U.S., that we are a country that celebrates Jews and Christians and Catholics. I don't always understand when it's appropriate to refer to Catholic as something separate, and you all look kind of Christian from where I sit. Sorry.
It's appropriate.
But, okay, thank you. What was I going to say? So there is this Judeo-Christian mythology that gets invoked in ways that are extraordinarily uncomfortable, to me at least. The idea, for example, of life beginning at conception is not one that has any basis in Jewish traditional legal discourse. Some of the ideas about gender do not have basis in Jewish traditional legal discourse, but it's a very convenient framing for those who would seek to claim that what they're doing is not just Christianity, but more of a multi-faith thing, or those who would seek to claim that, the U.S. is a Judeo-Christian nation. It's a little bit gobbledygook. And I'm very aware as a Jew that the dubious privilege minority status that Judaism has in the U.S. that, say, Islam does not have to the same extent, certainly indigenous religions do not have to the same extent, is entirely revocable at any moment. And that's part of what we're looking at with a possible Christian nationalist takeover of the U.S., but it won't be equal. And I think this is worth saying. Christian nationalism is going to privilege Christianity, but it's not going to privilege all Christianities equally. And it's probably going to privilege Judaism, as it has tended to, but it's not going to privilege all Judaisms equally. It's going to privilege it's going to privilege my colleagues who have been in support of theocracy and trust that there will be kickbacks for them. It's really foreign to me to name names of politicians from the sanctuary podium, so it's cool that you're doing it, but I'm not going to. So that's just some of the discomfort and challenge that I offer to the conversation for all of you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I just love the fact that the rabbi can come here and be comfortable enough to teach Christians about our Christian history and faith. Right on. So I want to follow up on the one thing, though, that you said, Ruhi, with Andrew, because I want to. This is the tough question, and he's not been prepared for this. For instance, this morning in this congregation, we heard a wonderful sermon about God shows no partiality from Acts 10. At the same moment, we read, as I referenced earlier, from Revelation 19 of the coming of the Lord who will rule with a rod of iron. So there's these two different views within the Bible that are kind of struggling with each other, right? Is the Bible part of the problem?
He said he's not going to defend the Bible.
Well, yeah. Well, I guess let me just start by, I love being lovingly critiqued by you, Ruhi. It is always a privilege, and I think it is very important that we name it, that Christianity lots of terrible things have been done in the history of Christianity, in the very recent American history of Christianity. And so, our lovely little flyer, is this Christian, is it American? The sad reality is very much yes, at least if we are going to go by how people have presented their cause, right? They deeply identify as Christian, and it is not for me to say, oh no, you're not Christian because you don't do it my way. Rather, within the inter-Christian dialogue, the challenge and the call is always to try and have a conversation about what it means to follow Jesus and to follow gospel tradition and to critique each other, right? We have to work this out dialogically through debate and conversation. And so I think that's an excellent and important point that it's not just us versus all those wrong people out there. Dan, I would say that there's not just two visions of, within the Bible. The Bible does not speak with one voice. The Bible is multivocal. There are lots of ways that you can read the Bible and justify all sorts of awful stuff. Okay, like slaveholders in 19th century America were Bible-thumping, Bible interpreters, and they made arguments. Now there are abolitionists who made other arguments, right, critiquing and countering, but there is no one biblical vision for how we do this thing called life. We are all responsible within our communities to interpret in a way that is consonant with principles of love, justice, and mercy. And so I think that, to your point, Dan, it's just going to be important that we identify very clearly what we are doing in the name of Christianity, how we are saying the Bible should be or could be or is being read. So white Christian nationalism, and I throw the white in there because even though not all Christian nationalists' beliefs could be identified as racist, there's a very strong correlation. That tradition, if we can call it that, of biblical interpretation has they claim that it is a literalist interpretation. And anytime there's the question of literal interpretation, I think it's important to ask, what exactly does literal mean? I think that very often what we're dealing with is a co-opting of the symbol of the Bible or the symbol of the Ten Commandments. I mean, we have the Ten Commandments outside the courthouse or inside schools, but I'd say very few people are actually following all 10 commandments, right? I mean, and they don't, but that's not important ultimately. It is more the symbology of the Ten Commandments that's being utilized, the symbolic power that's being co-opted for the sake of privileging a certain group.
I would just add to that, too, that it also depends on which version of the Ten Commandments, right? Because different groups order them differently and actually have different things in them. They're all in there, but there are actually 11 or 12 that get grouped in different ways. So it depends if you're reading the Jewish version, the Protestant version, the Catholic version, the Lutheran version that's closer to the Catholic version. But that's another fun topic. I've only got 2 more questions before we take our break. And by the way, there are those index cards that you were handed for you to write down questions that we'll collect after the break. And this is for any of our panelists. So an example of Christian nationalism that I often use comes from a prayer spoken in the early days of the Great Depression by the leader of the country, in which he prayed, quote, "Providence withdrew its protection, and our people fell as scarcely any other people heretofore. In deep misery, we again learned to pray. And in this hour, we sink to our knees and beseech our Almighty God that He may bless us, that He may give us strength to carry out the struggle for freedom, the future, the honor, and the peace of our people. So help us, God." Now, that seems innocuous enough. We hear prayers like that all the time, except that the prayer was not spoken in Washington, D.C. by President Roosevelt. It was spoken in Berlin by Chancellor Hitler. So here is my question for the group, because we hear all this conversation about who is a fascist and who is not. Right at this very moment, President Trump is leading a rally in Madison Square Garden, where the Nazi Party in the United States, known as the German American Bund, famously held a rally with 20,000 people in 1939. So are we faced with a new form of Nazism that's rising in our country? Is that what we're talking about? Any of you want to take that challenge? Phil?
Yeah. This is a big question, isn't it? On one sense, the answer is obviously yes. We've had these kinds of issues arise before, Lindbergh before World War II, and other times. But when I think about this kind of issue, I think about the book that I was reading recently, written in 2005, and forgive me the name, and the author does not come back to me. But the opening paragraph of that book says that the right has proposed an idea or a set of ideas about what Christianity means. And the left says nothing. And I can't help but bring my own faith into this a little bit, so please forgive me for doing that. But my view of Christianity is that it is the announcement by Jesus that there are 2 great commandments. One is love God, and the other is love your neighbor. if the left, and please, I use that word very loosely, if the left fails to talk about that message, then the odds of the far right that believes in hate, division, war, and the requirement that people must behave as if they believe the way the right wants them to, then the fascist rising is very, very dangerous. And if forgive me for putting it this way, because it's very personal to me. If we want to represent Jesus in the world, if we as Christians, and I know some people here aren't, so please forgive me for saying it this way. If we want to represent Jesus in the world, we have to be willing to say, God is about love. And he doesn't, God or she doesn't separate people from love. Doesn't matter what color you are, what nationality you are, who you love. God loves everybody. And I think one of the great ideals of the United States is the idea that we all have to manage our own beliefs, and we don't have a right to impose our beliefs on anyone else. The great problem of the fascists in rising is that they don't believe what I just said. They believe that it is their duty to God to impose their beliefs on you and me.
Thank you, Phil. Go ahead, Peter.
In the parallel to Madison Square Garden, I just think back to January 6th, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, this is our Reichstag moment.
Yes.
And I think that we are witnessing something very akin to the rise of Hitler.
A little louder.
I just said I think we are witnessing something very similar in the United States, perpetrated by a minority, very similar to the rise of Hitler.
Yeah. Rabbi?
Sure. Well, while I agree in substance with my fellow panelists, I think the question is a bit of a red herring. We can, and it's, I think the idea of Nazism is triggering enough to many of us that we can get very caught up in arguing over whether something is or is not that. What we're seeing in America is bad enough. You know, it's bad enough whatever you want to call it. It's going to be bad enough whoever wins the election. Maybe worse depending on one outcome, but the election is close enough. You know, the election is not going to be so decisive that the vision of, you know, xenophobia, racism, it's, you know, Christian nationalism, all the isms are thoroughly trounced and sent back to their holes. Like, we know that is not going to be an outcome of this election. And so then I think the really important question is then what is the work?
So that's the question I'd like to end this section on, because, yeah, we've heard all these things and all these concerns and fears and what might be. So what is it that you think we need to do? And the more specific you can be about those of us in this room, the better. What is it that we can and should be doing if we are this concern of the threat to democracy, and for me, the threat to Christianity, that Christian nationalism represents. And I will come back to that, the experience of Nazism, because there was a tremendous, the German word for it is Auseinandersetzung, and I always have trouble coming up with the English word. That's the first thing that occurs in my mind from my 3 years living in Berlin, of this coming to terms with our own history. And what happened after World War II, where Christian leaders for the first time began to take an internal look and to say, you know what, the Holocaust happened because we made it possible. We created the belief system, the anti-Semitism and so on and so forth, the history of pogroms and all of that. And it was out of that that the whole movement came to change Christianity, and particularly the anti-Semitism inherent in Christianity. So I hope we don't have to go through that kind of experience in this country to bring about that kind of change. So what can we do now to bring about that kind of change that we don't have this kind of horrendous result? So anyone want to offer? Go ahead, Jenny.
I mean, I guess I'll say two things. One is I think the study of history is really important. So we hear about, some plans that schools can't teach about slavery. We hear about things like that where you're not learning how history has unfolded before. I think understanding where we've been is extremely important to having a better idea of how to guide our future. So that is one thing I think is really important. The other might be a little controversial, which is I think that part of the division that we're seeing at the national level is the decline in people really getting together outside of, their immediate groups, outside of their spheres of people who believe the same things that they do. And I do think having, I think there used to be more civics organizations where you had people from the community with different beliefs working side by side. I think having that type of thing happen more and more, so it's harder to basically just point and other a group, that you are basically able to meet people with different beliefs and able to hang out with them and realize that many of us want the same things. We have very different views in how to go about them sometimes. And I think sometimes it's easy for political movements to take advantage of that and stir up division and stir up hate and stir up a dislike and an othering of people who don't believe like us. And so I think that creating more opportunities for people to get past that is important from a social level.
Yes, I think there's a number of things, depending, as Rabbi Ruhi points out, I mean, this election, no matter what happens, Christian nationalism is going to be with us. So how do we respond? I think that, first off, we use our voices and our privilege for those who have less. It's very important that if we see harm being done to our fellow humans, our neighbors, that we speak out and resist. That's a really important thing that we have to do. We cannot be silent. I think there are also, be civically engaged. I mean, it is important that we exercise our rights as citizens and help sway the process through our democratic voice. I think that's really, just what we have to do to change the system at all. I think it's important for inter-Christian conversations to have conversations with people with whom you disagree on these issues. And if you hold the Bible or the example of Jesus as a common norm, do Bible study together. Have conversations with people that are different in opinion, but who might, you might be able to bring them along to the vision of Jesus that has motivated you toward a life of love. So just a few things that I think we can do productively depending on how we move forward.
Anyone else? Rabbi?
Sure. I really appreciate what my fellow panelists have said, and I want to add particularly to what Pastor Andrew just said, advocating for and helping those who have less. That includes Christian nationalists, right? It's not just those who are going to be targeted by Christian nationalists, thank you, But the cynicism and opportunism of politicians and pastors of mega churches aside, the base of Christian nationalism, the base we know of all religious fundamentalisms, are people who are not having their needs met other ways. People who are feeling like the existing systems have neglected them. And so, especially to you Christians here, I think a lot about how in all the work of liberation, whatever it is, white people got to work with white people, Christians got to work with Christians, and so, I'm willing to work with you too, but I don't, I don't know that I'm going to be much use in those Bible conversations that you need to be having across denominational lines with your fellow Christians. And I'm looking out at this crowd and I see people that I know are already so invested in this work of conversation and collaboration across differences. I'm going to point out Luke, who works with Braver Angels, and Barry right in the front row, who's done a lot of conflict for the sake of heaven. And I think about, it'd be fun. We're a panel of people who all agree, roughly, that Christian nationalism is bad. We could get back together and have a panel about something we disagree about and model, how could we perhaps have a respectful and passionate conversation where we don't come in agreeing about things. So that's my thought.
I'd welcome it. Any more?
I don't do philosophy or religion very much. I just do politics. And
that's why we invited you here.
and I'm turning all my effort toward trying to get the United States House back for the Democrats. And I've got to tell you, having Speaker Johnson with his appeal to heaven flag and his background and leading the litigation against the legitimacy of the last election, counting the electoral votes if it's a close election, is unacceptable to me. And I've just got to say that these people, there are dangerous people that Trump will empower. Michael Flynn, Stephen Miller. These are dangerous people. And he's going to empower them, and he could shrug, he doesn't care. Do what they want. Use the military, use the United States military against civilians in the United States of America who are the enemy within. That's what they're talking about. These are incredibly dangerous and unconstitutional and illegal things that they're talking about. Trump doesn't know what the Constitution means. So I appreciate the discussion of religion here, but I'm working on the kind of the temporal part of this whole thing, trying to have not so bad of an election result.
Yeah. Peter broke the taboo. You've got to vote, and you've got to get other people to vote. And there's a lot of opportunities right now to do it, even remotely. You've gotten emails, I know you have, from places that are trying to turn out voters in other states where there are Senate seats and House seats up for election. And if you have a cell phone, if you have money you can contribute, do it today. Because today is the day.
Thank you. So we do want to take a short break. I'll remind you again, restrooms are back in this corner. There's an identical set up above. Don't go to the basement unless you know where you're going, because you might never come out. We are going to collect those cards. If you have written your questions, we can collect them afterwards too, but we have one of our ushers in the back who you can drop them off there, just bring them to the end, and ushers will come down and collect them. But what I would suggest you do in this break is turn to your neighbor and discuss a question with them. Find out what's on their mind. See if between the 2 or 3 of you, you can come up with a really good question. So we'll take just 5-6 minutes for that, and we'll come back for the second half. No, only afterwards. There are restrooms.
What if the early rabbis had made their peace with this other sect of Judaism? I know, like, Andrew probably wistfully thinks, what if Christianity hadn't allied with the empire? With bravery. Oh, awesome. What's your name? Nice to meet
Thank you.
Cards there.
I know, yeah, well, and we'll have time for maybe 4. That's always the challenge. What do you think?
Well, sorry to introduce politics, but to me...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, and for me, and that's why the church and state question is always so interesting. Because, you know, I spend a fair amount of time lobbying. You know, I want to have influence, you know, from my Christian perspective. But not the way the Christian nationalists are doing it, and not to be, you know, controlling. And I think, yeah, the church absolutely should be involved. And the black church, of course, is a wonderful example of their involvement in the political sphere. They have always been very active, and souls to the polls and all of that kind of thing. But even just having these kind of public discourse, you know, to have that place, let's come together as a community to really have, you know, serious conversation about these issues. Because, yeah, ultimately it comes down to politics because that's what governments are like. Yeah, absolutely.
Were you aware of the organization?
The what?
The Greater Rangers organization? Yes, we have a local alliance going on.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever be able to talk with the group at any time?
She gave me a brochure about a meeting that it's in. Do you have a separate? Because she was talking about a meeting in Eugene.
Yeah, well, the organization does all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
We've tried to open the door up for all our conversations. Invite in lots of community, have good conversations. Exactly what you're doing. She's in our posts. Would you be able to do something like that sometime? And how would we know to get a hold of her?
Yeah, do you want to look through them?
No.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. 2-minute warning. 2-minute warning. Do what you need to do.
I didn't listen. Where's the restroom? Is it
Okay,
through-
no,
through
yeah,
that
no,
door?
come this way. Yes, thank you for that reminder, because I might have. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm working in the election office.
Oh, I hear,
On the phone calls.
you know, and I think in Oregon you probably have it fairly easy, but I worry about even there.
Some people are very unhappy with
Yeah.
They don't like the election security. They think the lack of the security and secrecy involved now because we used to have that, you know.
Yeah, right.
But now they don't because of Lake County has it so high and you try to explain to them, they're not going to listen.
Yeah.
They don't want to listen.
Yeah.
But no, I've had the big question the first week I'm doing customer service after the phone call. The big question the first week is, why? I'm looking at the voters.
And there's no
count,
Trump.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
the number
Well,
one question.
it's not our fault.
No, but the person playing the secretary saying,
Yeah.
it's all
Yep,
Democrat.
yep. Oh, only that it's dark. Yeah. Should probably turn this one on too.
Now my big one is checking the ballot, checking to see, getting replacement ballots. Is our first plus?
Yeah. Well, they're so convinced that cheating is going on.
There's some people are just, the ballots seem
Yeah. Well, that happens. Yeah. Yeah, I know, right? It's going to be a little. Okay, if I can encourage people to find their seats. And so we'll start with one word from our sponsor, I guess. I'd like to introduce the Reverend Dr. Sharon Warner, who retired as Dean of Lexington Theological Seminary and taught two classes here on this topic, and is probably as much or more than an expert than any of the rest of us, but she's also my cousin. So, Dr. Warner.
No family resemblance, let me tell you. I bow to the feet of my cousin Dan too often here. It's wonderful to see you today. I just want to call attention to the resource table at the back. I've pulled together several of the resources we used in the two classes in which we studied Christian nationalism here in this church. And some of the resources I've seen since. It's no attempt to be comprehensive. When I went online, there's just incredible amount out there right now that's being published and it's being presented to us. And so I encourage you to take a look at that. But there are handouts back there. You're welcome to take any or all of them. I want to say that when we studied this issue, there were three major books that just helped us a tremendous amount. And I put them on the bibliography, or the suggested bibliography in the back. One of them was, we spoke about the history here, which I appreciate from the panel. You know, you don't understand what's going on unless you understand where we've been and how we got here. And the credible book was Daniel Hummel's new book. Well, actually, I think came out in 23. That's a year and a half. The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, how the evangelical battle over the end times shaped a nation. Incredible insights into the theological and historical movement that has brought us to where we are today. And then two that we've just found so helpful. One was Pamela, I think it's Cooper, I misspelled it here, Cooper White, The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, Why People Are Drawn In and How to Talk Across the Divide. Again, to speak to what you say. How do you talk across the divide? Very, very practical, nitty-gritty. This is how we can do it, people. And she was very helpful to us in the study, very helpful. And the other one that was a powerful one is Catherine Stewart's book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. The Power Worshippers. Incredible, incredible. I want to call your attention, many of you know about it, is the work of the American United for the Separation of Church and State. I have three of the periodicals back there that you can look at, Church and State. This is a powerful group in what they're doing, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And just this last issue, September 24th back there, three powerful articles, Education or Indoctrination. As public schools go back into session, Americans United, this is the organization, fights a rising tide of state-sponsored religion. State-sponsored religion. Again, what we are facing. And then the next article, wouldn't you imagine, Supreme Theocrats, the anti-freedom, anti-life, biblical worldview of the Christian nationalist majority on the nation's highest court. Powerful article. This is a great group, and I hope if you're not aware of it that you'll take a look at it and really support them in their powerful work. I had a couple web pages on this list for you to look at, and just a new one that I heard from this morning from my sister that I didn't know about. An article from How Mainline Protestants Are Addressing Christian Nationalism. And in that article, I'm told, again, I just heard about it this morning, and I'm told of all the statements from different denominations that have been made about Christian nationalism. Now, what the denominations have said. And it lists many of the denominations, including, I think Marilyn told me, Roman Catholic, which is fascinating that was in there. So take a look, and again, it's not comprehensive, but any of the handouts you're welcome to, and resources, and let's dig in. We can't say everything, right? In an hour and a half, 2 hours, we can't say everything. Continue to learn and study it and become active for all of us. That's our challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, a recording of this panel will be online, found at the YouTube channel Heart of Eugene. So I have a lot of questions. We only have 30 minutes left. We're not going to be able to get to them all, so I apologize for that. But we had 2 or 3 people that asked specifically about our slogans. And I'll share this one. Our money says, "In God we trust." We pledge allegiance as one nation under God. We swear to tell the truth in court on a Bible. Take the oath of office with our hand on a Bible. So how do we justify criticizing those who are zealots in their Christian faith about what they think is right for our country and oppose those who are against Christianity? Do we have a right to think exclusively? Andrew, you want to start?
Well, speaking of kind of taking responsibility, that is the mainline Protestants' fault, okay? In God we trust, one nation under God, all of that didn't come about until the 1950s. Well, In God We Trust was on coins even earlier, but it wasn't adopted as our official national motto until later. And so it was actually largely under the power of mainline Protestant pastors and influential thinkers that America kind of, adopted some of these slogans. And so, disentangling the history of Christianity in America with how we want Christianity to function in America is part of the task. So I think when I criticize Christian nationalism, I'm also kind of pointing the finger back at my own tradition of mainline Protestant advocacy for this fusion of Christianity and state. And I think that the past doesn't have to be prologue, and what we have to do is decide how we want things to move forward. So I think we are still on solid footing to criticize those who utilize the language and symbols of Christianity for purposes of subjugation of others' interests and prioritizing of their own privilege, even if it's also true that within the history of American Christianity, there has been maybe less separation of church and state than would have been healthy.
So, a related question, someone writes, I was somewhat shocked as a 5th grader in the 50s when under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. And probably most here remember that, given the age of this audience, which relates to a second person who notes that and say, where are the younger people and what do we do to bring, and particularly teach our younger citizens about this history who may not know that under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s, assumed that it was always there. So who can speak to that specific issue of why that pledge was added to the Pledge of Allegiance?
I can't speak to it historically, but it's even come up at school board meetings where typically we opened our school board meetings, with that pledge. And we had some members that felt comfortable saying the words along with it, and we had some members that didn't, and we had some that spoke some of it and not other parts of it. And so, we wound up not including that at the beginning of the meetings, not because any of us were protesting feeling patriotic or American, but because it did feel like it was either excluding some people or putting them under scrutiny for their religious beliefs, and that wasn't the environment that we wanted to open our board meetings with.
So Phil, you know this history, I'm sure. You're my historian, I always rely on.
I remember it because I was in elementary school at the time, I think. But I don't know the political situation behind it. Eisenhower was president, I think, and people were feeling very grateful for the the prosperity that was developing in the United States at the time, and full of a kind of naive.
But what was the movement in the 50s that prompted us to put that into the pledge? It
absolutely.
was McCarthyism, anti-communism,
Right.
so on and so forth, that
Thank
it was specifically, it wasn't for religious reasons, it was for political reasons that it was put into the
Right.
Pledge of Allegiance.
I just failed the damn test.
I saw some audience members out there who said, I know. I said,
Yeah,
yeah, well, I do.
that's
too."
right.
Peter, were you going to add to that?
Yeah, no, it was the McCarthy movement, godless communists, and the threat of world domination.
Yep. So, Rabbi, you want to add to it?
I was just going to say, I think this is another sort of example of this fuzzy boundary between Christian cultural hegemony and Christian nationalism. And I think, right, like having the pledge said at school is one thing. Punishing students who refuse to say the phrase under God would be Christian nationalism. So I think there's gradations, so to speak. Thinking as trying to responsibly steward my energy, I'm probably not gonna use my advocacy energy to get In God We Trust removed from our currency. I think there's more relevant fights to be fought. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about it.
Sure.
Another quick comment. The last
Closer to the mic, Phil, if you would.
The last thing the rabbi said makes an enormous amount of sense to me. The legislature opens most sessions with some kind of an acknowledgement. It could be a prayer from a minister who happens to be the minister for one of the members, or it could be a musical thing or something. When the Democrats took control of the legislature back in 2007, one of the things we talked about was, should we end this way of opening our sessions? And we concluded that it simply wasn't worth the energy that it was going to take to do it. The fact is that the nation is not a nation under God. However much some of us might believe that it is. And the fact is that the civil authorities and whatever beliefs we have in God must be separate for a whole bunch of reasons we haven't talked about at all today yet. And yet the temptation to think that that the nation somehow needs to be under God is very strong.
It's always on.
Is it? Okay. I'm trying to, and I was just going to look it up. Sometime in the era when Gingrich was challenging the Democrats and that the House started, they challenged, and the House adopted, starting every day with the Pledge of Allegiance. And I'm trying to look up exactly when it was.
I know,
but it was when I was in the House. So anyway, go ahead with something else.
There was a time you weren't in the House?
Yeah, there's
Sorry,
some
I
people
couldn't
about
resist.
that, but there was a time when I was there early on where we didn't start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
When you find that, you can let us know. Here's another good history question that reflects the learnedness of our audience. Commenting that progressive Christians and members of other faiths, as well as socialists, communists, anarchists, Marxists, and other leftists, share a common enemy in Christian nationalism. On the one hand, there was a rich tradition of Christian and Jewish socialists in the United States, especially before World War II. On the other hand, since the Cold War, there has been a massive amount of misinformation about socialism pushed on the American people, and much of this misinformation was put out by the Christian nationalist groups such as the John Birch Society, Tea Party movement, MAGA, QAnon, and others. So the question, how can progressive religious people do their part to overcome this legacy of distrust and propaganda to build a new movement that combines progressive politics and a religious community that respects people of all faith or no faith? Big challenge.
You're getting closer to the topic that I thought we were going to talk about today.
Yeah, just talk closer to the mic when you're talking.
We do not think clearly about law and religion. Anyone can believe anything about the cosmos, how it came into being, the intervention of God in history, if there is any such thing, and on and on and on. Anyone can believe that life of a baby begins at conception, or the Judeo-Christian belief that the life of a child begins at the first breath after birth. You can, and people have believed all kinds of wild and strange things through time. I mean, anybody who's ever studied any religion knows what I just said is true. The law, on the other hand, is a completely different topic. It has to do with the interaction of people among each other, keeping people safe, allowing for commerce to occur in an honest way, protecting property, and for allowing people to live the lives they want to live without interference from others in an untoward way. That's what law is about. And frankly, it has nothing whatever to do with religion if it's understood correctly. And I think that's a point that we don't really talk about very much. The British got to it a little bit when they came up with the concept of the King's Peace. If you violate the King's Peace, then you're in trouble with the king and you were going to be tried in the King's Court. If you murdered somebody, if you committed a theft, if you did all kinds of other things that we know are crimes, you were going to pay for that if they could catch you at it and prosecute you. But even though those things overlap with what the Ten Commandments or other religious beliefs tell us, they are not the same thing at all. And I think as long as we have fuzzy thinking about those two ideas, what I believe about God and what I understand about how we live together are absolutely separate things. As long as we don't understand that, then we're in trouble with people like the Christian nationalists who want to combine the two.
Wait, 1 second there. Okay, try you.
More than that, we're really in trouble with whatever majority happens to be in power at the time. It could be Christian, it could not be. It could be a subsection of Christianity. And I think going back to our historic roots in this country, that is very much what some of our founding fathers were concerned about. Jefferson and Madison, they believed that compulsion of religion violated a person's right to be able to live their life based on their own convictions. And so I think that idea is very important, and that I would say, part of what Peter DeFazio was talking about earlier, we have seen, a shift in the Supreme Court and the way some of those things are interpreted, the way the Establishment Clause is interpreted, that balance between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So for decades, we had something called the Lemon Test from 1971 onward that looked at 3 factors for whether the government was unduly interfering or favoring one religion over another. And those 3 factors were: the law must have a secular purpose, the primary effect must not promote or inhibit religion, and you couldn't have excessive entanglement between government and religion. It was 2022, so just the past couple of years, that we saw a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton. You probably read about it in the papers. It was a high school football coach who was doing prayer after the football game. He was fired, and that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, was a divided decision, and that basically announced that the Lemon Test was no longer applicable, and instead the Establishment Clause had to be interpreted taking into account historic understanding. So some of the cases that Dan was talking about earlier, those things are very much in play with how you balance those things and how much should history shape our understanding of our law going forward. Keeping in mind that historically, as a nation, we've done some really questionable things that have been embedded in our legal decisions and our law.
So this question really follows up on that. In your opinion, how strong is the First Amendment to stand up to the tearing down of the separation between church and state, and particularly in light of the recent SCOTUS decision? Is the First Amendment strong enough?
Well, I would say it's less about, just one amendment than how you balance different concepts within that same amendment. And how do you balance the not interfering with somebody's ability to practice their religion or lack of religion versus making sure that government isn't putting its thumb on the scale in favor of one religion. And I think that is something we're going to see a lot of over the next few years with the Supreme Court. How they interpret that will have a big impact on, I think, day-to-day lives.
We had the Maine case where Maine was allowing public funds to be used for secular private schools. They were sued, and the court determined that that was discrimination against religious schools, and they were ordered to not discriminate between secular and religious schools. And that's sort of, I see this creep coming.
A couple of questions bring it back to the personal level. I've heard well-meaning people refer to good Christians as those, many here, who try to understand and represent the ideas of Jesus and love thy neighbor, but is that term acceptable? It implies that the others, including Christian nationalists, are bad Christians. So should we refrain from referring to good Christians? And I think the rabbi kind of challenged us on this too, right? We're all Christians. Well, not bad or good. Anyone want to address that?
Well, I'll be a broken record. Jesus demands that we love the people who don't agree with us about that topic.
About what?
I think in many religious communities, there is a tendency to say that the people who practice and agree with what we think of as the right way of practicing our tradition are the good ones. I think one of the funny things about progressive religion is that what we tend to call the good Jewish values or the good Christian values or the good Unitarian values or the good Muslim values are actually often the same values. And it may be uncomfortable to note, but some of the things that actually make our religious traditions distinct from each other, and they are the things that aren't those universal values that we all share. Like, yes, the Torah also says love your neighbor and also says love God. And I bet the Quran teaches that too somewhere. So I don't identify as a good Christian myself, though I try to love my neighbor. And I don't want to be called a good Christian. So just to offer you that twist. And I think like we gotta love our particularist parts as well, those of us who have them, who have a religious tradition, and that I think goes back to the last two questions you asked, Dan. I think our institutions in the abstract are only as strong as the people who are stewarding them, are only as functional as how they are being stewarded. And I think we bring our deeply held convictions to our advocacy, to our leadership in the arenas where we are leaders, and that goes for politics too. And I think religious fundamentalist Christians are going to bring their deeply held convictions, which are Christian, to their legislative work. And I think it is the job of all of us to bring our convictions to that work. I don't think there is a clean line between law and religion. I think the law stems out of our enacting of our deeply held convictions, and we should probably all be honest about that.
One of these questions, actually,
Before we
go ahead.
on,
Go ahead, Phil.
I have to respond to that. I agree that that is actually what happens a lot. But I also think that people thinking clearly about the difference between my personal religious beliefs and my understanding of what society needs to function well requires clear thinking and requires me and you to be able to differentiate between the things that I believe to be true about the universe, the Creator, and my strongly held religious beliefs versus the things that I understand to be good for society in general. And if I'm unable to consider that those are not necessarily the same thing, I think we're in trouble. I think it's really important that that lawmakers and that voters be able to understand the difference between what I believe to be true about creation, the universe, my relationship to God on the one hand, and what society needs in order to function well on the other is really critically important, and we don't do it enough.
So this question maybe follows up a little bit in terms of thinking of this right versus left. Whether it be Christian nationalism or any group, right or left, should it be agreed that it is both portions of the right and left have been, continue to be, pressing their philosophies, ideologies onto others who may not agree. So we're each trying to convince the other side of the rightness of our view, right? And maybe what needs to be recognized, how do we integrate that into a whole rather than to be opposing one another? Do we just recognize that, we have this multitude of views and somehow we have to learn to live with each other and respect with each other? And I don't know if that works when we're talking about Christian nationalism.
I think understanding the impact, the personal impact that different policies or different ideas can have on people, particularly those who are less privileged, is one way that, we may disagree about different ideas, but that we can hopefully come a little closer together on what the impact of certain policies are on people.
And this question kind of brings it home to, again, real practical issues. One person asks, how can we protest what we see happening, like signs we disagree with? And, we've all seen those trucks driving by with really offensive slogans and, kinds of things. People espousing horrible and dangerous ideas without causing more hatred and division. And then someone else asks, if we are faced with violence, including possibly death, what does the panel recommend we do? Is nonviolence sufficient? Do we resist with strength? What does that mean?
Yes, run away. If you're faced with imminent threat of violence or death, go the other direction. But I think we have to remain committed to nonviolence as a key cornerstone of our political process. That just has to be a common value that we uphold and don't budge on.
Here's another really interesting question regarding the Fourth Estate that we really haven't discussed. So much of our problem here reflects the collapse of traditional journalism, the Fourth Estate. How can this be remedied? Otherwise, propaganda will be increasingly mislead and polarize some who have good intentions, who are not the subverters. Is that the right word? Can't read the handwriting. But anyway, you get the notion, the whole breakdown of traditional journalism, and then coupled with that, the rise of social media, and particularly now with X under Mr. Musk, that just has no guardrails and allows anything under the doctrine freedom of speech. We should allow all kinds of misinformation and not be checked in any way.
Well, I know in 2016 or 2017, I think it was, Timothy Snyder published on tyranny. And one of the recommendations he made was don't preemptively capitulate to the tyrant. And I've seen some analyses in this past week commenting on the refusal of certain news organizations to issue endorsements against the wishes of their editorial boards, that is a preemptive capitulation. And so I think I'm not an expert in the press. I'm not an expert in a whole lot, but I do speak from the place of faith communities, and I think one of the strengths of faith communities is that it is often having the grounding in faith and the affiliation with a faith community that helps people find the strength to not capitulate in the face of intense pressure and coercion. So with entire respect to the atheists among us who I know are able to be good for goodness sake, for me, I think affiliation is immensely helpful. We are going to need each other. We are going to need to provide each other solid ground because we're not going to get it elsewhere. And this may be one of those moments where if all your life you've been thinking, what would I have done in 1940? Now we get to find out. And we cannot know, we cannot know who among us will capitulate.
1940, but 1933, right?
Yeah, 1933. I mean, you said something earlier about, hoping we won't need to do a reckoning in a few years. There's reckonings we need to do that we've refused to do, and that's a big part of what this whole moment is about not wanting to do reckonings that we owe our country if we care about our country. So.
Ask this question, Rabbi. Oh, go ahead, Jenny.
Dan, I would also say that this is one of the reasons we need strong public education. As we see our journalism, continue to lose independent journalists, and as we see social media result in people reading headlines or 40 characters or less to try to understand an issue, this is all the more reason we need really great public education so people learn to read source materials, to read different perspectives, and to actually read the article itself, not just the titles. I think public education is one of the key ways that you create engaged citizens of the future who have critical thinking skills and can go on to be great citizens and supports of their community.
You earned your position on the school board, for sure.
I'm not biased or anything.
Yeah. So this question normally would be presented to the rabbi, but I'm going to challenge the rest of our panels to think about it. How can we help the Jewish community stand against anti-Semitism that has infected society? And I know, Andrew, that your congregation led an effort just recently. If you want to tell us about that and any other reflections on what we can do to stand up against anti-Semitism. And Rabbi, you can just add what other wisdom you want to add.
Well, yeah, just for context, in response to a request from Rabbi Ruhi, a number of Lutherans from the area got together and stood outside outside of Temple Beth Israel on Yom Kippur, and just as a way of welcoming them and standing as a bulwark and as a support. I'm afraid we scared a few of them inadvertently. We tried to, hey, we're here, we're friendly, we're on your side. A couple people didn't know what to make of us.
You took correction well, though.
Yes, good. And that was just an effort to say, in the midst of this particular political moment in the Middle East, it is hard for people who are Jewish here to kind of deal with the stress of all the implications. And so we came to stand next to our Jewish neighbors because we are in relationship, because we love and want to support them. And I think that is actually, with all these questions of how do we fix this? How do we move forward? What do we do? I keep on coming back to this principle of relationality, that we have to be committed to being in relationship with our neighbors. We have to be committed to conversation, the hard conversations that are uncomfortable, so that we have the relational basis for societal change, for making a difference in our world. We don't do that without the relational connectedness. So I guess I don't know exactly how Christians will be able to support their Jewish friends all the time, but that's one concrete example. And to be willing to say yes to the invitation, that's one thing. But then also to do the work of imagining how you can support so that you don't always have to wait for the ask, or you don't have to make a minority community do the asking.
That's lovely, thank you. So I have a couple of thoughts, and I didn't know this question was coming, but so one is that the Jewish community is non-monolithic, and it's really helpful to remember that. The other is that we face two intersecting problems. One is a rise of anti-Semitism, and the other is our internal perception of the rise of anti-Semitism. So, for example, one college student, God forbid, wearing a kippah gets beaten up on a campus somewhere in the country, and we all get activated, and that totally subsumes all of these small acts of kindness and solidarity that you might offer. So I think, I truly do think, and maybe this is naive of me, that there are worse problems right now, and that anti-Semitism in the US is not as bad as I sometimes feel in my gut it is. Though no Jewish person ever long-term wound up looking intelligent saying a sentence like that. But I think one thing that is helpful, and is probably helpful across other identity line questions and solidarity questions, is to remember that we're not you. When we have conversations across difference, it's very tempting to focus on our commonalities and to focus on the ways that we should all try to get along, because really we want the same things. Really, we're just like each other. But actually, most Jews who are just like everybody else are not the Jews who experience anti-Semitism. We experience anti-Semitism when we attempt to assert our difference, whether that's visually, or whether we are asking for a dietary accommodation, or whether we are asking for time off for a holiday that you haven't heard of that sounds like bullshit to you. So I think really, we talk about embracing difference, but I think we sometimes give lip service, and we think oh, well, we're embracing difference because we're not really different. But coming to other minority communities with genuine curiosity about what is that difference? What does it require of me to meet and honor, and if necessary, accommodate that difference, is the great question I would ask mainline Protestants and Christians and anyone else in a privileged position in the US to hold as you're thinking about solidarity.
There was one other question we don't have time to get into, and I'm going to rephrase it this way, because there's a lot of strong feelings around the war in Gaza, and that's just a whole huge topic, and I know it's a big topic in the Jewish community, and everything you just said about the Jewish community, we also have to say, in many ways it's true for the Muslim community too, that are victims in so many ways of violence and discrimination, and whether or not, if Trump comes back into the office, will we have another Muslim ban like he attempted once previously? So the question, because you've brought this up of having dialogue on an issue and where we don't agree, is it possible for us to have that dialogue in the midst of this conflict where we can come together as Jews and Christians and Muslims to talk about what we see, listening to one another and learning from one another in this time?
Possible for us to have a dialogue specifically about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the war in Gaza? Yeah, in theory, anything is possible. I think it is easier to have dialogue about issues that feel really charged, that feel really morally existential, when we're practiced having dialogue about things that don't feel as morally charged, I think we're not going to have great luck getting a bunch of people who don't know each other and don't already trust each other in a room to argue about something that feels morally existential, where different positions feel completely morally impossible to each other, if we haven't done some trust building in advance. So I would say, like, that would be, I think, like, all of which is to say, like, no, we can't have a community forum on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and and then go home and expect that to have been a productive experience. Maybe I don't want to say can't, because never say never. I'm skeptical. I think we could get together a group of community members who make a commitment to sticking with each other and respecting each other's stake in the conversation and having long-term dialogue, and that could be very beneficial for the community.
I'll close with this. You each get one sentence to tell us either what you gained or what you hope for coming out of this conversation. So, we're stout. Whoever wants first, because we need to be brief. So, one sentence.
I appreciate very much the things I have learned today.
Be engaged and keep showing up like you have today.
Be very involved in this next election.
Don't take what we have for granted.
Yeah. Yes.
To love your neighbor, you got to know your neighbor. So don't give up. Keep doing the work.
Yeah.
Would you please thank our panelists? So we do thank you for being here and being so attentive. One person wrote, "This discussion has reminded me of why I prefer to lead a life without a religious connection." Someone else wrote, Sinclair Lewis wrote in 1935, "It can't happen here," which it did in the book. We are not immune to this. So good words of wisdom for us to consider. Lastly, we do have refreshments. We invite you to stay for the next 20, 30 minutes just to have dialogue and continued dialogue and community to share together in refreshments. And I'm going to ask the Reverend Melanie Ullman to come forward to offer a benediction.
It's okay. If you're on your way out, you could just take a pause for a moment. And take a breath. What has been shared is weighty. And even more so, look around. For the weightiness is balanced, is made hearable by the companions that surround us on this journey. We take a breath and we give thanks for these wise and learned people who have taught us today and challenged us by their presence and witness. They've reminded us that we are all part of the profoundly intricate weaving that is the human community. Our beliefs, our actions, our words, all of it forms and impacts all of us. So, may you leave this place and return to your lives more rooted in the inspiration and solace of the divine by whatever name you call them, more rooted in the inspiration and solace of the values that animate your life and give you purpose. And remember always, you are an essential part of this great weaving, and may you hold fast to your place in this great tapestry of the human family. And by the blessing of this time that we have all shared, may you become more deeply aware of the threads that hold you and the threads that you can strengthen, renew, refashion to foster more love, more compassion, and more justice. So go in peace, dear friends, and know that you are not alone. Thank you, Dan. Yeah. Thank you for your